On the morning of the 2nd of May, 1536, a barge slipped down the Thames toward the Tower of London. Inside it sat a Queen of England. She had been queen for 3 years. She would be alive for 17 more days. A dense, highly curated sheaf of documents provided the foundation for the charges against her, a collection of letters, confessions, and signed indictments, carefully ordered to prove adultery, incest, and a plot to kill the king. Every piece of that documentary evidence passed through the hands of a single man before it reached the king, Thomas Cromwell, a low-born lawyer who filtered and engineered the narrative that would follow. By the end of this video, you will see exactly how he wrote a queen out of existence. A forged piece of paper, meticulously manufactured by a regime, is a vastly more dangerous and precise weapon than any army or assassin's knife. The Tudor court operated in 2 distinct registers at once. The first was the sacred, public facade of abbey choirs and royal pageantry. The second was a hidden, profane reality, a world of clerks cracking codes in windowless rooms, and waiting women reading letters they should never have seen. Intercepted private correspondence and carefully deployed signatures dictated the operational rules of Tudor politics. A single turn of phrase in a private letter could send a nobleman to the block. At the center of this world sat a king undergoing a psychological transformation. Henry VIII had once been a romantic Renaissance prince, but a jousting accident left him with a permanently ulcerated leg and a personality swinging between euphoria and paranoia. He became a ruler who demanded written proof for everything. This demand for proof created a deep historical irony. 17 of the love letters Henry wrote to Anne were stolen by a papal spy and sent to Rome. Today, they are held in the vaults of the Vatican Apostolic Library, the very church that excommunicated him. The version of Anne Boleyn that has come down to us through history, the witch, the seductress, the heretic, is a forensic reconstruction. It is a fiction successfully manufactured by her killers after she was dead. When Anne Boleyn became queen, she wore a gold bee at her throat and pursued 3 clear, fatal objectives: securing her position, delivering a male heir, and pushing England toward a reformed church. The political stakes of the entire English succession rested on Henry's failing 44-year-old body. His chronic pain and his grief over Anne's recent miscarriage of a son made the legitimacy of his marriage his primary obsession. Thomas Cromwell resolved that obsession through documentary genius. Trained in Italian counting houses, he applied the logic of double-entry bookkeeping to human lives. He recognized that truth was simply whatever the ledger could be made to say. Archival proof of this strategy survives in the dispatches of the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis. He documented Cromwell taking personal, explicit credit for inventing the entire case against the Queen. Cromwell secured the legitimate succession of the English crown by annexing the textual, documentary record of the Queen's body. The foundation of the plot was a brittle conversation about social rank. Anne had noticed a 23-year-old lutenist named Mark Smeaton sulking in a window. When she sharply reminded him he was an inferior person, he replied that a single look from her was enough. Smeaton was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney. He spent 24 hours there under conditions that remain disputed, though chroniclers mention him being tied with a knotted rope or grievously racked. By the next morning, he had confessed to adultery. This confession was never tested in public. Cromwell immediately embedded it into a private, manufactured schedule of charges before it could be scrutinized. While Smeaton sat in that windowless room, the May Day jousts proceeded at Greenwich. The king watched Anne hand a handkerchief to a courtier and abruptly walked out. He never saw her again until she was on the scaffold. Henry's next wife, Jane Seymour, was already waiting. Cromwell had pre-funded her lodgings, and Ambassador Chapuis observed that the king wore his horns patiently because the outcome of the case was already decided. By May 1536, the historical record had ceased to reflect reality. It became a real-time manuscript authored by Cromwell to legitimize a premeditated coup. The core physical forgeries list specific dates and locations for every alleged act. Historian Eric Ives proved these dates are mathematically impossible. The indictment claims Anne committed adultery at Hampton Court on a day accounts prove she was confined in Greenwich. The men were 3 counties away. This worked because Tudor grand juries were not required to verify dates against records. They were selected for reliability and returned a true bill based solely on the state-sanctioned charges. Henry's physical and mental state made him a perfect target for this documentary theater. A jousting accident had left him in chronic pain, sleeping poorly, and suffering from sudden shifts between euphoria and paranoia. Under this kind of sustained stress, the body enters what neuroscientists call a cortisol cascade, a state that markedly reduces critical thinking and primes the brain to accept any evidence that confirms its existing fears. Subsequent regimes added their own layers of documentary mystery. The famous Tower Letter, in which Anne pleads for a lawful trial, remains a contested document, likely a later transcription or a counterforgery meant to rewrite the narrative. The terror of the Tudor state lay in its bureaucratic efficiency. It possessed the ability to process demonstrably false physical geometry into legally binding, lethal verdicts. The trial of Anne and her brother George took place in the Great Hall of the Tower. They stood before 26 peers, every one of whom had been vetted directly by Cromwell.
During the proceedings, George Boleyn was handed a paper alleging the king's impotence. Instructed to read it silently, he instead read it aloud to the entire court, detonating the court's decorum and humiliating the king in front of the foreign ambassadors. Some argue that Anne was guilty of dangerous courtly flirtations that crossed a line. However, generic flirtation cannot account for the rigidly fabricated, physically impossible dates in the indictment. Archbishop Cranmer then produced the ultimate legal contradiction. He annulled the marriage, declaring it had never legally existed. This created a logical void. A queen cannot commit treasonous adultery in a marriage the state has just declared never happened. Anne's trial established a permanent European template for eliminating inconvenient women through rigged dates and manufactured sexual transgression, a procedure that would survive long after the Tudors. This map illustrates the geopolitical reality absent from popular history. Henry was diplomatically isolated, facing a Catholic alliance and the looming threat of a papal bull that would unify Europe against him. Cromwell understood the strategic geometry. Anne was the visible symbol of the wrong done to the emperor's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. Executing her and bastardizing Elizabeth was the necessary diplomatic offering to break the Catholic alliance. The cruel theatricality of the execution, including hiring a French swordsman for 100 crowns, broadcast a message of cleansing to Catholic Europe and a warning to English Protestants. The extreme public violence allowed Henry to erase the memory of his love for Anne. Only the Vatican letters survive as proof of the devotion he eventually chose to forget. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn's death served as the tragic price of a major geopolitical treaty, finalized with weaponized paperwork. In Part 2, we are going to walk through the actual discovery in a Brussels archive that changed the history of this case, and examine the modern terror of a regime that can rewrite reality with paper. I will see you on the other side. Please like, share, and subscribe for the conclusion.
On Tower Green, the Queen of England has been beheaded. The official story, recorded for the public, states she betrayed the king with 5 men, including her own brother. But the private dispatches of the Spanish ambassador reveal a different motive. The entire execution was a strategic arrangement to make a new international treaty possible. A diplomatic goal of this magnitude required a matching evidentiary record. To make the execution legal, the state had to fabricate the very logic of the crime. In 2007, Belgian archivist Sylvie Cornet discovered a bundle of correspondence in the Royal Archives in Brussels that had been mislabeled and untouched since the 1860s. Within the papers of Mary of Hungary, she found a draft of a diplomatic dispatch from an agent of Thomas Cromwell, dated April 20, 1536. Cornet identified 3 physical anomalies. First, the paper matched the stock used inside Cromwell's London office that spring. Second, decibers contained a Genoese watermark, a bunch of grapes. This was the specific stock of Antonio Vivaldi, purchased by Cromwell in bulk. Third, the wax seal had been broken and reaffixed 3 millimeters off-center. The document had been intercepted, read, and resealed before it ever reached its destination. These 3 physical inconsistencies mark the point where the official record separates from archival reality. The dispatch is dated April 20th, 10 days before the first suspect, Mark Smeaton, was arrested.
This indicates that the case against the Queen was being drafted before any of the alleged crimes had been publicly alleged. The draft instructions specify that a love letter in the Queen's own hand would be ready for delivery by April 24th. However, household records place Anne at Greenwich with the King that entire week, with no record of such a letter leaving the palace. Cromwell's own office was preparing for the existence of evidence that had not yet been written. Cornet eventually matched the Vivaldi watermark on this dispatch to a fragment of paper held at the National Archives in Kew. For 4 centuries, that fragment has been catalogued as a portion of a letter written in Anne Boleyn's hand. Forensics now suggest it was written on Cromwell's own office supplies. This evidence remained hidden due to a structural bias in English archival history. Early editors assumed surviving Tudor state papers were genuine by default, treating documents produced inside Cromwell's office as objective records of the world outside it. While some paper historians argue the Vivaldi watermark was common across Northern Europe, the draft's timeline remains a structural problem. The office of the Lord Privy Seal was preparing case material for a trial that had not yet begun. Cromwell manufactured a physical record of guilt on his own paper stock 10 days before the first arrest. This process of fabrication follows a universal pattern described by anthropologist Mary Douglas. In her framework, societies classify individuals who challenge established categories as monstrous. Monstrosity is a label applied when a body does something the system has no language for. Anne Boleyn occupied a position the system could not resolve. She was a commoner queen, a religious reformer, and a wife without a son. To resolve this tension, the court somatized its anxiety by inventing physical anomalies in her body. Decades after her death, rumors appeared she was born with 6 fingers, a retrospective attempt to categorize a political disruptor as a biological monster. Evolutionary psychologists suggest this response is rooted in amygdala threat detection pathways, which perceive social disruptors as physiologically threatening. The rumor of the 6 fingers was the biological expression of a political threat. This explains the shift in Henry's behavior. Drawing on researchers like Esther Perel and Robert Sapolsky, we can see how chronic stress and dynastic failure can turn romantic desire into categorical disgust. By 1536, Henry was neurobiologically primed to accept any evidence providing an exit from the marriage. Anne's fall was a neurochemical attachment crisis that the state resolved through the manufacture of paper. On May 17, 1536, George Boleyn was brought to Tower Hill. His scaffold speech was carefully coded, stating he died under the law, but not for those things I am here condemned of. It was a subtle denial of the specific charges of incest and treason. Inside the tower, the constable William Kingston recorded Anne's behavior for Cromwell. His reports describe a woman oscillating between laughter and resigned fear, the recognizable indicators of acute trauma. On May 19th, the public ceremony on Tower Green was strictly controlled. Foreign ambassadors were barred. The French swordsman, paid by Cromwell a week earlier, stood ready. A different truth emerged in private. According to the Spanish ambassador, Anne received the sacrament and swore on the consecrated host she had never been unfaithful to the king. In her theology, she was signing her soul to her innocence. She knelt on the scaffold and was blindfolded. The swordsman called for his weapon to distract her gaze. As she turned her head, he struck. The sword took her head in a single stroke. In 19 days, the state manufactured an alternative biography of a human being and then destroyed the original. The forgery became the permanent historical record. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The diplomatic stability Cromwell sought was secured, and the Catholic alliance against England remained dormant. Cromwell rose to the earldom of Essex, only to be destroyed 4 months later by the same documentary machinery he had perfected. The faction that survived Anne used a fabricated case of treason to send him to the block. The Vatican held Henry's love letters to Anne for 400 years. They were kept as strategic diplomatic assets, available to be deployed whenever the papacy needed to challenge the legitimacy of the English Reformation. Every generation has reforged Anne. She moved from a Victorian tragic heroine to Hilary Mantel's complicated portrayal in Wolf Hall. Each version is a revision written over Cromwell's foundational documents. This visual confusion extends to art history. Paul Delaroche's painting of Lady Jane Grey is so visually tied to the iconography of Anne Boleyn that the two figures are frequently confused in the public imagination. The Anne Boleyn of history is a palimpsest, layers of cultural storytelling written over a state-sponsored lie. The state reaches into the bedroom because it is the smallest and most highly leveraged unit of geopolitics. A queen's reputation contains the posture of an entire regime. This procedure of bureaucratic elimination was used on the Roman Princess Julia, the Empress Theodora, and the victims of Soviet show trials. The pattern survives every transition of regime. History is the product of who wrote the record, when they wrote it, and for whom it was intended. Once a document is read as a political object, the past can no longer be viewed naively. The 17-day timeline of Anne's fall was only possible because the dossier was already finished before she was arrested. The barge was not transporting a defendant, it was delivering a manuscript to its conclusion. The evidence has always been present in the archives: the broken seal, the prepaid swordsman, the Vivaldi watermark, and the sworn host. When an order decides that a person has become a threat, it uses documentation to destroy the body. The paper is the weapon. Tell me in the comments which fact lands the hardest. Subscribe and stay curious.